Welcome to AI Role Models, a podcast from One Strategy Studio that goes beyond the hype to explore how real leaders are transforming their businesses with artificial intelligence. In each episode, I'll sit down with pioneers from the world's leading brands who are reimagining marketing, insights, and innovation with AI. But we're not here to talk about theoretical possibilities. These are candid conversations about the real challenges, unexpected victories, and practical lessons learned from implementing AI in organizations. Here's today's episode. Good morning, everybody. It's another episode of AI Heroes. I'm joined today by Jenna Beglin. Jenna, welcome to the show. You're a product and insights leader from PayPal. Great to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. I love these conversations. So let's dive right in. Before we kind of get started, what we want to cover today is really thinking about kind of going beyond speed and efficiency and like how AI should really unlock kind of new possibilities. And obviously we talked before the show a little bit about this, but before we kind of dive in on that topic, can you just share a little bit about your background and how you kind of got into research overall?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think I came to research in a little bit of a roundabout way or a non-traditional path. I started my career more in traditional strategy consulting, which again, it's not terribly common for a researcher. One of the things for me that I always felt like was missing in the consulting world was that we were oftentimes basing our strategies off of like a second or third or fourth hand account of what an executive thought their end user and stakeholder was thinking. And you weren't often getting to have that direct conversation with the person who was really ultimately influenced by the decisions you were making.
Yep.
And that was the part I felt like was missing and I was really passionate about. I didn't even truthfully know that the career of research within an organization existed until I went back to business school, got my MBA, truthfully went back into the world of consulting briefly, and then learned what this whole world of research was. And for me, when I learned about it, it just clicked. And I was like, this is where I want to be, is having these real open conversations with the people who at the end of the day we're serving. And it just sort of clicked for me. And since then, over the last, call it 12 to 15 years since my MBA, I've bounced around more across a bunch of different product functions. So between product strategy, UX research, I've hopped over to the product marketing side. I've done market research. And so I've sort of bounced around this product and strategy research insights world for a while. And now, like you mentioned, I am currently at PayPal. I am a principal researcher supporting a lot of our early stage products and innovations, including a lot of the work we're doing at PayPal with AI and all things agentic. So a little bit meta in terms of using AI to research AI.
Yeah,
that's what I do right now.
100%. Well, it must be, fascinating to see. I mean, there's a lot of announcements over the last few weeks about agentic commerce and where that's all heading. So it must be a fascinating place to be doing research. I guess you talked about kind of going to business school and like being disconnected from the people that were making the decisions or hearing it fourth or fifth hand. And what is it for you, I guess, that's so important about talking directly to consumers and getting their feedback?
I think when you're getting a filtered view, you're losing a lot of the nuance of really what people need and what makes them tick and what makes your product valuable to them. And losing that nuance, a lot of the devil is in the details when it comes to what you're creating and making sure you're designing and developing a product that's going to meet someone's needs. I think the other piece of it is, and this is a personal passion of mine, is I've always been fascinated by different cultures and how they approach using different products. So just to give a little bit of an example of how that comes to life for me is whenever I travel to another country, the first thing I do is go to a 7-Eleven or a supermarket and look at the different chip flavors, like potato chip flavors.
Yeah.
Because you can just get such an understanding of like local flavors and cuisine through how some of the major chip brands have innovated for local markets. And so it's just always been a passion of mine to understand how different people approach things differently. And anytime you get into a research study, sometimes people are thinking about things in a way you could have never fathomed. Certainly not the way you think about it. And I just think it's so fascinating to me.
For sure. And you spend time both on the kind of research side and more on the UX research side of things, which is, I guess, quite unusual. A lot of people kind of stick in either one side or the other. How do you think that kind of experience having both sides has kind of rounded you as a researcher, particularly at a company like PayPal?
It's funny. I think there are very differing schools of thought on whether market research and UX research are very different or very similar.
For sure.
There are some people who really believe they're very different disciplines and the skill sets are not easy to transfer. I'm not necessarily one of those people. I think if you are approaching research from the perspective of what's the question we're trying to answer, and then let's design the right study to answer that question, regardless of what methodology we're using. If we're asking the right questions and we're using the right methodology, we'll be able to come to a useful answer for an organization. So I've actually never really, I think the skills are quite transferable. And so I don't know, I've sort of moved between those two worlds. I think what's actually possibly more influential in the way I approach research, not having worked on sort of UX and market research, but actually having been on the strategy, marketing, product side and the research side, because I think that's given me maybe a stronger perspective on what research stakeholders actually need, the real decisions they're trying to make, the real questions they're trying to answer, and like being able to tie the research to actual strategic recommendations and actionable decisions within an organization. And so for me, I think that's actually maybe shaped how I approach research more than anything.
Yeah, no, that's I mean, I agree about the skill sets being more similar. It's so interesting. I think there's people definitely fall on either side of that debate pretty strongly. But I'm sure, having spent time at a Meta and now PayPal, there's a lot of value in having kind of both perspectives and much more of a kind of combined view of we're solving for the same challenges and what are people actually looking to do. I guess kind of before we kind of jump into kind of your journey with AI and how that's changed and evolved, thinking back to kind of more traditional research methods, what were some of the kind of biggest challenges in getting to quality consumer research in a pre-AI world? And I'm not saying AI solved all of them, but what was your biggest frustration maybe looking back 2, 3, 4 years ago?
I think one of my biggest philosophies with research is that it requires a lot of creativity.
Yep.
And that's why I'm so excited about the opportunities that AI affords in the research space. But I think truthfully, the biggest challenge to getting to good insights was that people fall back on really rote traditional types of research where I'm going to do an in-depth interview, or I'm going to do a standard survey, or maybe I'll do a diary study if I'm feeling spicy, right? But like there are so many different ways to approach research and so many different methodologies. And I think a lot of the times what you see even today, and you saw especially several years ago, is that people fall back on what is easy and easily explainable to stakeholders, and they've done a lot of times, so they know how to do it. And it falls within budget, especially if you have DIY tools.
Yep.
It can be limiting the budget in terms of like, I have to use this tool, which shoehorns me into a certain subset of methodologies, right? And so oftentimes I think the big challenge is just lack of creativity when it comes to how you approach research and the methodologies you apply, because when you limit yourselves to those methods, you're only getting insights that are applicable to those methods and maybe not more like contextual or point in time insights that might be really crucial and necessary for certain learning areas.
100%. So thinking about kind of the role of AI, and we all know AI, machine learning, has had a role within research and insights and data and analytics for a long time. But thinking about this kind of next wave of AI, LLMs, generative AI, I guess when did that first appear on your radar as something relevant and impactful to consumer research?
So it's funny, generative AI happened right? Because it just sort of sprang forth from the ether. What was it, like 2.5 years ago at this point, ish? When I was actually not in research at the time. I was in product marketing, and I worked for an AI SaaS platform company called Data Robot, and the company traditionally had its roots in machine learning and predictive AI. So helping organizations more easily build, govern, operate AI models internally, more machine learning AI models. And that side of the business was sort of maturing and sort of stagnating, I would say, truthfully. And then generative AI happened, and it was just this breath of fresh air for this AI platform and startup. And so a lot of my time there was spent figuring out how to create a generative AI offering to let companies create these machine learning and generative AI models in one place and have them governed and managed in one place and use them in tandem with one another, which opens up a whole variety of different things you can do with AI when you're pairing the machine learning and predictive AI with the generative AI. And so I was actually really fortunate to be in a place where I got to learn the nuts and bolts of how generative AI worked and talk to so many different companies about their concerns, how they're like the challenges they're having, what they're excited about, the use cases they're trying to enable, right? Being on the SaaS platform side of things, we were talking to so many different customers and companies just about how they were thinking about it in these very early days. And that I think was huge in terms of shaping how I view generative AI, both when it comes to the opportunities as well as the risks, because so much of what we were seeing and talking about were the uh-ohs of generative AI. And I did a podcast and wrote a nice long blog post when I was there a few years ago, just outlining all of the huge risks of implementing and leveraging generative AI within a corporate application and within an organization. And so these risks really became front and center for me, and like making sure it is implemented in the lowest risk way possible and used responsibly.
I feel like that's such an interesting kind of starting point, because in that product marketing role, your job is to get people excited as you are about it. It's to communicate well. It's to understand create curiosity whilst handling potential objections or areas of skepticism. So yeah, that must have been a really kind of great kind of grounding for kind of coming into this space. Because product marketing, I guess from where we are today and the speed at which things have evolved from those early conversations, obviously there was a lot of skepticism, a lot of gotchas and watch outs and things like that. I think many of those things still apply at a fundamental level. But how have you seen the people's attitudes to this evolve? And it's become such a commonplace part of our lives so quick, like more quickly than any other technological invention. But yeah, I'm just curious as to how you've seen that evolve.
It's funny because I think there's a bit of danger in terms of how it's evolving, because people's comfort and usage is growing like very quickly. But the quality isn't necessarily getting that much better that quickly. And so you have people, I think, making more critical decisions and relying more heavily on this technology that isn't often accurate. And truthfully has a lot of limitations in terms right now of what it can do. And perhaps the underlying technology might have fewer limitations, but certainly in terms of how it's implemented within an organization, what tools you have access to, what use cases have been enabled, what applications they've built on top of the AI, right? I still think there are a lot of shortcomings within organizations of having implemented something that is very useful. But people are more and more trying to rely on these things to drive critical decisions and help them with a lot of their work. And so I actually think right now we're in a bit of a mismatch, which creates a lot of danger because people are relying so heavily on these things, oftentimes blindly. I'll admit myself, I am guilty of, and I know the risks and I know how wrong the answers can be. But I'll myself ask a question to Gemini within a Google search and just blindly trust the answer, right? And so I think we're in a bit of this dangerous stage right now where people are heavily adopting and relying on it, but the technology isn't as accurate as it should be for us to be doing that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a risk that critical thinking disappears, more than it should. I think when we were talking before the show, we coined it the race to mediocrity and the challenges that are created there. Like, talk a little bit about what when you think about that race to mediocrity, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think the challenge with generative AI is that it will always give you an answer.
Yep.
Whether or not it's right and whether or not it's like high quality is a different question. And so what I worry about when it comes to research is I think I've already talked a little bit about the fact I think that good quality research is actually very creative. It's creative in terms of the methodologies you choose, in terms of how you structure interviews or discussion guides or participant activities, in terms of the survey questions you write and how you approach them, in terms of how you communicate these things out, right? I think there's so much creativity that goes into doing high quality research, that I worry too much about relying on the output of these LLMs. Because oftentimes what I see when I try to use them for generative activities in the research space, like write me a discussion guide, write me a top line synthesis, it is not meeting my quality bar. And I imagine it's not meeting many researchers' quality bars, which to me, like you're entering into this, like I said, this race to mediocrity, where if everyone just starts relying on these tools, you're going to get very generic, very watered down research. I think you can take that same comment and apply it to other areas like brand and marketing. If you start relying too heavily on it for creating campaign ideas or even like campaign copy and content, you're going to end up in a very generic space very quickly without a lot of creativity. Now, the flip side of that is I think it is enabling the democratization of research in a way that hasn't really been done before. And so for smaller organizations that don't have the resources to hire a big, highly skilled research team or put a lot of budget into research, it is letting people sort of do totally adequate research who weren't able to do any before. What it's not doing is maintaining that high bar of quality. And so I see this sort of like race to mediocrity impacting sort of small and medium businesses probably more than it's going to impact the large enterprises, which I believe and I hope will continue to maintain sort of the rigor.
Because of an unawareness of what true quality looks like?
I don't even know if it's an awareness of true quality, but simply having the resources to throw at high quality, right? It's not, research isn't cheap. It's not quick. To do it well requires a certain level of like understanding and skill and experience that I think oftentimes more the small and medium-sized businesses don't have the resources simply to invest in that level of research. And so generative AI, I think, helps democratize it, but I think it comes at sort of a cost quality trade-off compromise, as most things do.
Yeah, for me, I think the big cut through between how do you avoid mediocrity and how do you avoid creating this C-minus work is if you're purely relying just on the foundational models alone, you're lacking deeper context. And I think the more context, the models do an incredible job, the more context you give them. And the more context that could be proprietary data, again, feeding in additional data, nuanced viewpoint, whatever it might be. But for me, context is king here, and context is really the key to having, kind of unlocking more from the models than what essentially everybody has access to out of the box.
Yeah, I absolutely. And I think that most people, right, it's still new. People are learning how to use these things and prompt them accurately and successfully. And I think most people don't know yet how to draw out of the models what would be useful. I also think that there's maybe a lack of respect and understanding that sometimes in order to draw something good out of the model, no matter who I am as an individual, I'm not going to be able to, on my own, carve out enough time and thought to actually write a really good in-depth prompt. And that's where, offerings like One Strategy come in, where like, this is what you guys are doing. You are focused. Many people have focused 100% of their effort on building out these agents and actually engaging with the models in a way that's going to extract something really high quality that otherwise you wouldn't be able to. And I myself, as one individual who also has another full-time job, would never be able to get to that level of rigor, right?
100%. I think that's the thing. A lot of people are judging AI output on a purely what we call like a one-shot response. Prompt output, that's the best AI. And I think the companies and teams and engineering teams that are building more sophisticated multi-step, multitask agents, there's that agentic approach to multiple prompts, multiple data sources, refining that data over time, looking at it from a critical angle with, putting that data through different thought processes and frameworks. And that's really the difference between, we can all come up with a, half decent prompt and one shot it into Perplexity or ChatGPT, but it's more how we can kind of, go deeper, discover more. And then there are, one thing that I do like is often, we bring our own limitations of the connections we can make, particularly around like, kind of innovation and connections between things. And I think that's one of the things that the models do well is I'll often make connections that, as humans, we maybe ignored. So it's kind of fascinating to see, but the future definitely is a hybrid between human intelligence and how do you augment that with models, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I don't envy you. You guys have a uphill battle because I do think that's such a strong perception of people that I should just be able to use an LLM and get out of it whatever I need, not recognizing that they're like building an agent takes and a network of agents that work together to create something really quality actually takes a ton of effort and skill and expertise. And so I think right now, certainly you're working against misconceptions that are difficult to change people's minds.
Seems like we need a good product marketing manager. So kind of thinking about one of the things we talked about was like the role of AI should be to unlock new possibilities. Well, what are things that we couldn't do before? So when you think about evaluating AI-based solutions and unlocking new possibilities, how do you approach that?
It's funny because so much of the focus right now is in cost savings, right? How do I analyze this faster? How do I write this thing faster? Yeah. And first of all, I don't necessarily think generative AI is all that good at doing that yet in a way that can truly replace those activities. But second of all, I think those things are going to happen as people just get used to using it as part of a toolkit in their everyday working life. Yep. Those aren't the most exciting things to me. For me, when I'm looking at generative AI, it is unlocking new methodologies and ways of approaching research and extracting insights that we've never been able to do before. And that I think is the most exciting piece of it. So I'll give you an example. I think for me, the thing I'm most excited about, truthfully, is like true quali-quant. Mm-hmm. Which means simultaneously extracting qualitative insight and quantifying it at the same time, which has been incredibly difficult to do in any sort of high quality way up until now. You've got natural language processing, sure, and it was able to like extract themes from text-based responses and open ends. But you're now in this world where if you have an AI moderated interviewer, like an AI moderated interview, You can do interviews at scale. So you can get to quantitative scale in a way that myself doing qualitative interviews never could. I can interview 500 people, 1,000 people, because it's the machine doing it. And with generative AI, you have the ability to sift through the transcripts and the themes and the audio sometimes on the back end and quantify that, right? And like quantify those themes that people are expressing verbally in a much more conversational, natural way. So you can dig into these insights and quantify them simultaneously in a way you never could before. That's super exciting to me. The other thing I think that sort of one strategy and what you guys are doing is the way, truthfully, I look at it is social listening, but with far more advanced output than traditional social listening has ever given you in the past. And so I think most of us know traditional social listening tools up until this point, for better or worse, they mostly gave you positive or negative sentiment and a word cloud of words people were saying, which was never terribly useful or actionable. With generative AI, you're able to do that social listening, scrape the entire world of the internet, and apply your organization's context if you want, and then generate something actionable of value on the back end from all of that social listening. And that's something that has never been able to happen before either. And so I think that there are so many new interesting methodologies it's unlocking that's enabling us to get these rich insights in a way we never could before.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an exciting time. And as you say, I think the capabilities to talk to more people, to access more data, obviously, the garbage in, garbage out data quality thing has always been a problem. Social listening tools have struggled with that. It's great that you can grab the Twitter fire hose or comments from this and that, but it's not really then combined with more authoritative sources, proprietary data. And I think that what we're enabled now to do is to get real context from human interviews, real context from the web, real context from, published articles, deeper research, proprietary research, customer data, lots of different inputs. And again, I think that's what the model's doing an incredible job of is sifting through and joining the dots between all of that, which at a human level would be nigh impossible. So thinking about kind of the future and where all this is heading, when you think about kind of AI strategy and the tools that you're using, you're going to see a mix of centralized tools that are maybe built in-house by teams and created using proprietary data. You're going to see a mixture of third-party tools or points-based solutions that are kind of there. How do you think about kind of building that strategy personally, and obviously kind of from your perspective around kind of like what should that stack look like?
It's funny because I also think my time at Data Robot probably colored a lot of my opinions on sort of an internal AI tooling strategy at an organization. And I think there is such value in having all of these things unified in sort of one space.
Yep.
Because I think you can connect the dots across different teams in a way that's really valuable within an organization. What the reality is that there are certain use cases, and I think most teams have these, that require a much more rigorous and like complex like application and agent to be built on top of the LLMs, than either our like many internal data science teams have the capacity to handle or have the skill set to handle. And that's where I think the point solutions will come in. And so for me, it's like when I look at the centralized strategy, having these, it's really good for enterprise-wide tools that everyone in the organization is going to be using, because like those are super critical and very easy to prioritize within an organization. But when it comes to hyper-specific applications built on top of generative AI, those are the things that are much more difficult to build and likely won't get prioritized, because rather than impacting the 50,000 or so people who work at PayPal, it's the 50 of us on the research team, right? And it's super complex and hard to build. I'm thinking things like AI moderated interview platforms, or things like doing research with synthetic personas, for instance. Not saying those are things we will adopt or have adopted, but I can see a lot of instances where a point solution is going to be necessary simply because the centralized strategy isn't going to be able to handle that.
Have you seen that play out in terms of organizational approach to making those decisions? A lot of companies now are introducing AI councils, and again, procurement and onboarding new tools is always an evolving space. What have you seen so far, and where would you like to see that head?
Yeah, I think there's two things. I think it's really important that every team within an organization set clear guidelines around and guiding principles around what they will accept and what they won't accept when it comes to generative AI in their own personal space. Yep. I can look at it from a research perspective and say we should never use this type of methodology because we don't think it's going to be accurate, or we don't think it takes like proper data precautions, or whatever it be. I think every individual team is really responsible, because they're the domain experts, of setting what those guiding principles really are. And then I think for point solutions, right, which are necessary, they're going to be necessary and they're going to happen. I think it's incredibly important to set up AI councils and reviews for any external tools you're bringing on, because, like I said, we're domain experts in research, not in AI, and whether or not it's safe and it's accurate and it's unbiased, right? And so we need experts within our organization to be able to help us evaluate these tools and make sure we are onboarding good tools, for lack of a better word, right? And I think it's funny, because I think in practice you're seeing some frustration because these AI councils are inundated, because everyone is looking for these really valuable point solutions.
Yep.
And so these timelines for approvals take a really long time, but I do think they're remarkably important, because there is so much that can go wrong, just quite frankly, and without implementing it responsibly, and with controls, I think it creates just this recipe for disaster.
Yeah, no, I mean, AI councils definitely have a role to play. I think, as you say, there's the challenge has become it is so critical, but every single department within the business is seeing multiple tools that could help, and then trying to define as to, as you say, what's an organizational level thing, or what do we need in external expertise that have built something specifically for that 50-person, 200-person team that kind of really understands the nuance of that role. One of the things we talked about a little bit prior to the call was around this idea of kind of model collapse, and in terms of how feeding AI generated content back into AI systems eventually, where does that lead us? Like, talk to me a little bit more about kind of what your concern is there.
It's funny, because I think there is a prevailing belief that generative AI is only going to get better. Yep. I sort of take maybe a controversial opinion there, and I think it's going to get worse. And the reason I say that is because right now these models are drawing from real content that real people have created. Yep. That is out there in the ether, right, on the internet. Fast forward 2 years from now, how much of that content is machine generated based off of what was once human generated? 5 years from now, how much of that content is really human generated, right? And I think you head down this slippery slope where
you have a photocopy, right?
Right, you're seeing the synthesis of a synthesis of a synthesis. And so now you're pulling, fast forward 10, 15 years from now, on a synthesis from human generated ideas and thoughts and copy from 15 years ago. Right. And so that is my fear of the danger of where it could be headed. I think what's really interesting in research is we are super unique in that we are generating net new human insight. That's our job, right? It is to actually talk to people and learn new things, real people. And so I think we actually have a really interesting, important role to play in that future world. where we are bringing that real human insight and then analyzing it. That is where I get, I'm a little concerned about certain methodologies that rely only on AI generated content or content that they're pulling from the internet. And I think probably one strategy, this is something you guys will have to think about and really grapple with in a few years, is like, how do you actually get over that hump of we've been pulling from what existed that was generated by humans, and now it's all generated by machines, right? How has that impacted the quality of what we're really seeing? And so that's where I tend to like to rely on real human generated insight analyzed in a really different way. What I'll say is, like, when I think about one strategy specifically, what I do love about it and what has made it a methodology that's easy to adopt is that you're not looking for accuracy and you're not looking for the right answer, right? You are looking to drive inspiration and innovation. And like, I think there is a huge role for generative AI, and I think it's quite good at that right now. When you compare it to the use case that some people are trying to use it for, which is generating accurate information, right? And so I actually think that makes it quite palatable to use, because at the end of the day, like, you don't have to get to the right answer. You're in fact trying to push people's thinking. So
yeah, absolutely, I agree entirely around kind of the use cases around pushing people's thinking, connecting dots that people can't see it is where we see most value. I think when you think of, it's been said before that, data is the oil of the industry. That's the most valuable asset. And I think, there's obviously a lot being done with synthetic respondents, and, you've got AI interviewers talking to real humans. What happens when we end up with AI interviewers talking to AI like doing deep qualitative interviews with AI respondents? And yeah, I think it's really interesting to see. I think fundamentally as an industry, there's been such a race to the bottom on the value of that data in terms of what we're willing to compensate consumers for their opinion, that we already were on a path to eroding that. And I think, genuine human insight and proprietary insight is going to be so much more valuable in today's world. And then how do you kind of pull that together? So yeah, it's a really interesting challenge. Obviously something that we think a lot about. I think something that, the large language, whether it's the Geminis or Claudes or ChatGPTs of the world are going to have to think a lot about as well, because there's, the amount of content being created, the amount of output that's now in the world, that's, repurpose of existing information is just, it's just huge.
And it's happened at such a staggering pace, right? So I say 2 years from now, but it could be the end of this year, right? That we're really in this world where so much of what we're seeing is actually machine generated. So it's really interesting, the challenges that I think we're going to face as researchers and as a society.
100%. So kind of to shut things down, I guess, what would be kind of what do you think the most important lesson is you've learned about integrating AI into kind of, your professional life, and what kind of advice would you have to, peers across the industry that are kind of in similar positions?
I would say, and this maybe doesn't even just apply to generative AI, but research in general, and I think generative AI is just the new tool in people's toolkits, but get creative with your research.
Yeah.
Use your toolkits in interesting ways to extract like good insight, and to be able to communicate your insights in sort of an interesting, more creative way. That is what I like to. It's an area that's I'm really passionate about, because I think that's just what makes good research. And I think AI is another new and the newest, shiniest tool in the toolkit to be able to approach research in a more creative way. And that's what I'm excited about. And that's what I would urge other researchers to do, is to just figure out how to use it creatively, figure out how to use it in tandem with your other historical methodologies creatively, to really up level the quality of research.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's great about that is you talk about creativity both on the front end in terms of how you're conducting, how you're capturing this data and research methodology, but you also hit, I think, what's the critical point is how do you get creative and engage stakeholders? How do you get creative in the delivery of that? How do you get creative in inspiring? And that is something we've seen a great deal of opportunity, now with Gen AI around, creating podcast outputs, mini video shorts, bringing snippets to life. There's just so much opportunity now to elevate our outputs so much more than the traditional deck that kind of sits on the shelf and gathers dust.
Absolutely. And so much faster and cheaper than it ever has been before to create things like a video with an AI generated person talking, or a podcast, to your point. There are so many more interesting creative ways to communicate your insights that it's also opened up, not just methodologically. And so I think it's a fun time because we as researchers can get pretty creative and sort of revive our approaches and just like interest and excitement around research using it.
1,000%. Well, Jenna, really appreciate you being a guest on the show. It's been a fascinating conversation. If you're listening, please like, subscribe, follow the show. If you want to connect with Jenna, she's on LinkedIn, just Jenna Beglin. And then from there, we'll see you all next week. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to AI Role Models. Follow now wherever you get your podcasts to be notified of new episodes. Connect with One Strategy on LinkedIn to join us for live recordings. Don't forget to leave a review, and we can't wait to see you again soon for our next episode.